Good day, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining today's edition of Teneo Insights. I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York City. 16 months ago, the world watched in horror as Russian troops invaded Ukraine and marched on Kyiv with the intention of effectively decapitating the state within days, if not hours. 5 days ago, Russian troops prepared to defend Moscow as Russian militia marched on the capital. There's perhaps no more stark illustration of the numerous failures, economic, military, on the world stage, European energy dependency, NATO enlargement, you name it, that Russia and Vladimir Putin have brought on themselves. Since the war began, the question has been not only how the war would play out on the battlefield, but relatedly, could Putin's regime and power structure survive a costly war with no end in sight? The events of last weekend have not given us an answer to these questions, but they do suggest that Putin's grip on those keeping him in power is under stress, and the consequences for Putin, for Russia, and for Ukraine are unpredictable. I'm joined today by three colleagues well known to many of you in the audience who can help us understand the implications of these dramatic recent events. Michèle Flournoy is the Managing Partner of WestExec Advisors, Teneo's partner firm, which she co-founded in 2017 with Secretary of State Antony Blinken and two other colleagues. She served as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy during the first Obama administration. Andrea Kendall-Taylor is a WestExec Senior Advisor as well as a Senior Fellow at the Center for a New American Security. She has served as Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council and as a Senior Analyst at CIA. And she and a colleague have written the lead article in the new edition of Foreign Affairs called The Treacherous Path to a Better Russia, Ukraine's Future and Putin's Fate. Your timing, Andrea, could not be better. And we're joined by Andrius Tursa. He's the Central and Eastern Europe advisor to Teneo and our lead coordinating analyst on Russia and Ukraine. He joins today from Vilnius, Lithuania, which will be hosting the upcoming NATO summit the week after next, and is less than 40 miles from the border with Belarus. So I want to thank all of you for joining today. And perhaps, Andrea, I can start with you, as we were talking about yesterday, you and I. Maybe set the table here for us, and with the benefit of 5 days hindsight now, what happened? Why did it happen? Why did it happen now? Why the sudden deal in the middle of it all? What's your sort of read at the moment?
Well, thanks for having me back, Kevin. And it certainly was an incredibly dramatic 24 hours last weekend. And as all of the events were unfolding, I think there was really a high degree of uncertainty and lack of clarity about what was actually happening. But as you said, with 5 days, we have insights and a little bit of a better sense about what's happened, although we should be clear that there's still a lot of uncertainty, particularly about implications. But kind of where we are now, I mean, I think it's clear at this point that the insurgency set off by Yevgeny Prigozhin was not intended to topple the Putin regime. That was not clear as events were unfolding, but his audio messages, as well as kind of things that we've learned since the time, have made it pretty clear that this was largely about kind of corporate interest and Prigozhin and Wagner fighters' desire to protect the Wagner organization. If you remember, earlier in June, the Russian Ministry of Defense made an announcement, an order that would require all private military companies to sign a contract with the Russian Ministry of Defense. And so that was clearly a threat to Prigozhin and his organization. And really, I think when you look at academic literature on coups and other insurgencies, that factor, corporate grievance, is often the catalyst for these armed and violent attempts to try to protect those financial interests. And so I think that is very much what this was about. In terms of, I think what was extremely remarkable is 120 miles from Moscow, Prigozhin says, calls it off and says that, okay, this is done. And again, it comes back, he didn't have a plan. It was never, he didn't want to march into Moscow because that was never his intent. I think you referenced the deal, and I think the thing that is clear there is that Prigozhin is on the losing end of that deal. He basically was not able to secure, I think, anything that he set out to do. First and foremost, the Russian government has said that all fighters who did not participate in the insurgency can sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense. And really importantly, he was not able to catalyze the firing of Shoigu or Gerasimov within the Russian Ministry of Defense. And we know, that we've watched that play out over the last several of months. And it seems at this point that Putin still is largely backing those two Russian officials, Shoigu and Gerasimov. So he really is on the losing end. We know that he's now been exiled to Belarus. I think one of the key questions is, why didn't Putin deal more decisively with the threat? And I do think that he had an understanding of what this was about. And I think for the time being, in terms of Prigozhin, Putin is basically biding his time. Because if he would have violently gone after him, or if he would have tried to remove Prigozhin from the scene, I think he would have jeopardized the onboarding of Wagner forces, which he now critically needs, particularly as Ukraine is mounting its offensive. So I think that's where we are, and I'm sure we'll get into the broader implications of what this means for stability inside Russia, as well as Moscow's ability to execute the war.
Yeah, honestly, sitting there watching that on Saturday was really tough to know who to root for in this one. But you made the point that Prigozhin was on the losing end of this, and that Putin has an interest in perhaps deferring action on him to some degree because of the need to incorporate Wagner's remaining troops and materiel and all of that. But do you think, I mean, is it your view that Prigozhin ultimately is sort of dead man walking, or can he live to see another day and be of utility to Putin?
I think Putin is going to bide his time because he doesn't want to alienate those Wagner fighters. But I think that's one of the key unknowns, is kind of the future of Prigozhin and the Wagner organization, because I do think that some of these negotiations, there's been some reporting that Prigozhin returned to Russia either yesterday or today to continue with some of these negotiations. So it's really unclear to me what Prigozhin's future is and what the future of the Wagner organization is. They very well may continue to operate out of Belarus, and that creates a whole nother set of implications that we're going to have to kind of process. So to me, it's really clear. I think Prigozhin for the time being is safe because of the imperative not to alienate those Wagner fighters. But I think his future and Wagner's, the organization's future, to me, is one of the key question marks.
So I want to unpack some of that, but I want to bring Michèle into the conversation here, because so here we have the mutiny has been headed off, but the fundamentals sort of that led to that mutiny that Andrea just described, haven't really changed in a lot of ways. So, but bottom line though, Michèle, in your view, is Putin weakened? Now that seems to certainly be the prevailing conventional wisdom that has emerged in the last several days. This has been the most dramatic challenge to Putin's leadership that we've seen, at least overtly, since he came to power over 20 years ago. But having said that, in many ways, his omnipotence had been sort of shattered all along throughout the prosecution of this war. But there's been these sort of there's been these confusing narratives. On the one hand, on Saturday morning when he came out and spoke, he said that these were a bunch of traitors and he was going to destroy them. And then mere hours later, kind of cuts a deal. But to Andrea's point, Prigozhin's the one that blinked ultimately, and Putin saw down this most obvious and powerful threat, the strongest rival on the field, if you will. And that's got to have a powerful demonstration effect against other would-be challengers to him as well. So in your view, where has Putin wound up as far as we can now tell?
So I think it is a mixed bag. He obviously still has control on the instruments of repression in the Russian state, which are substantial. And yet, I think from a perception point of view, the fact that Prigozhin was moved against him, that there was really no resistance when he took over the Southern Military District headquarters, that there was really very little, if no resistance, as he made his way towards Moscow, and just sort of the general lack of any kind of response on behalf of Putin to sort of slow or stop him. I think it has created the perception that maybe Putin is weaker than we think. Maybe he doesn't have the sort of strength of loyalty from the various factions and institutions. And so I think if there is someone out there or some group of people who are thinking about, we need a better leader, either because we don't like how the war is going or we don't like how more importantly, how Russia is being run, I think it creates an opening and perhaps a little bit of a sense of maybe he isn't as impenetrable or as strong as we thought. So, but that said, he has tremendous instruments of repression at his disposal, and that remains a fact. So I think it's a very mixed picture. But I think if you said, is he weaker today than he was before? Yes. Is he weak enough to be toppled? That's the question, and I don't think it's as clear an answer.
Right. So, news reports suggest that U.S. intelligence had sort of anticipated that this was coming to a head. I don't know if they necessarily knew it was going to be Saturday morning or Friday night, and exactly how it was going to play out. But if U.S. intelligence is warning the White House about this, and yet these guys rolled into southern Russia and straight onto the headquarters of Southern Command and a city of 1 million people without any resistance whatsoever. Was there a surprise there? Is your view, or was it, as Andrea kind of suggested, that Putin recognized this for what it was, so let him drive himself into the corner and we will actually end this, all things considered, as painlessly as possible?
Yeah, I don't know that Putin anticipated it happening. One of the challenges in authoritarian regimes that we saw even with the, when the Ukraine war started, is that people don't like to speak truth to power when that can get you shot or eliminated or fired from your job at the very least. So it's not clear to me that Putin had the information. I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if he wasn't expecting this. And from the early rhetoric and his early response, I'm not sure he knew what it was right away. I think, and Andrea's right, I think eventually he understood this is actually more about the Wagner group than it is about him being taken out of power. But I think, the risk of his miscalculation, which we've already seen dramatically in Ukraine at every moment, is very real, in general, because of the system that he's sitting on top of and the fear instilled in people for voicing any dissent or any bad news that he doesn't want to hear.
There was a Western diplomat who was quoted in the New York Times the other day. He said, "The system Putin built is very stable, but if I woke up one morning and saw tanks on the street, I wouldn't be totally astonished." Obviously, the worst case scenario for Putin is division and rebellion, right? I mean, he himself, I guess, emerged from that kind of chaos of the 1990s in a sense. And has anything gone to plan since February 24th, 2022 for Putin?
I don't think so, especially when you look at Ukraine. I mean, he assumed it was going to be a short, sharp, decisive intervention. He was going to roll to Kyiv, put in a different government, more controllable by Russia, and then leave. Obviously, that didn't happen. He certainly didn't think that the Ukrainian forces were any match for his own. And was surprised there. He thought that this would drive a wedge within NATO and make NATO weaker and fall apart. That didn't happen. NATO came together, stronger cohesion than anybody anticipated, and now we're expanding to include Sweden and Finland. So, I think strategically at every level, this was a terrible blunder for him. I think he can point to some things like keeping China on side, although this recent chapter, I'd be interested in folks' views on how China is going to react to Putin after this episode. I think overall, this has not served his interests well. And he's now an international pariah, can't travel for fear of being arrested. This has not gone according to plan by any stretch of the imagination.
So I want to bring Andrius into the conversation, kind of continue on the Putin front. I know Andrea's done a lot of work on authoritarian regimes and how they end and the like. But Andrius, I think from the layperson like myself's perspective, oftentimes the way we see these authoritarian regimes end, they don't go on a sort of steady downward trajectory. They look very, very strong, like carbon fiber, right? They're very strong, and then all of a sudden they sort of shatter. That's the way it appears from the outside. I guess the question here is, again, with regards to Putin, is he still the guarantor of the elites' wealth and security, the people who kind of keep him ultimately in power? I mean, it sounds like, listening to Michèle and Andrea and others, that the damage here has been done. But as long as he holds his nerve and holds the levers of military and security power, which looks like he has both of those, then he can continue to hold on. And let's not forget, he's been this regime has been very resilient, notwithstanding the failures that Michèle just described. But they've lived through the sanctions. The economy has been a bit more resilient than some had, than the sanctioners perhaps had hoped. The public has remained quiet, and the like. How do you see the Putin and domestic political situation?
Yes, thank you, Kevin. So I completely agree that latest events are really weakening Putin, and it was a major hit to his authority at home. And first of all, I think it's important to put this in the context. So it's not only latest humiliating Prigozhin's drive to Moscow. In recent months, we've seen highly humiliating incursions into the Russian territory by various armed groups. We have seen regular strikes on Russian cities, especially Belgorod, by the Ukrainian forces. We've seen mysterious drone attack on the Kremlin. So in my view, these events just indicate that Putin's authority is kind of diminishing, and he's no longer able to serve, ensure the security of the country, let alone of his own regime. His authority is eroding. That is clear, and latest events was another hit. Another point here is that the latest is the Prigozhin's uprising or mutiny showed cracks in his regime. So there is a general perception that during the past 2 decades in power, Putin has built around himself sort of a coup-proof system, which includes the appointment of loyal, but not necessarily most competent persons to key positions, especially in the military and security apparatus. And he created a system where various security agencies and military intelligence are competing against each other and spying on each other. So even if one part of the apparatus decided to plot something against Putin, others would likely know. Now we have a situation last weekend where it seems the U.S. intelligence had some reports, some information about the possible Prigozhin's actions or some instability, and Putin did not have that information. So to me, that suggests that there is a structural weakness or a crack in his regime, and this institutional setup built to prevent coups in the future is somehow not functioning as it should be. So whether that means an immediate threat to Putin, I don't think so. I agree. He has huge security apparatus and his disposal, but the fundamentals are eroding, and there is a growing perception that he no longer serves an arbiter, right, between various interest groups, at the motion, of his demise, basically gradual demise of the system has been set into place, and it's enough time from now on.
So, can I ask you a quick question about the Russian people in all of this? Obviously, when Prigozhin spoke, he basically kind of refuted the rationale for the invasion into Ukraine. It sort of suggested that President Putin had been lied to by his own advisors for their own ends. But we saw some pretty remarkable pictures of Russian people in Rostov, sort of welcoming Wagner and cheering Prigozhin on as he left. And I understand that public apathy is sort of one of the designs of an authoritarian regime. It keeps everybody quiet. They don't know what's true, what's not, et cetera, et cetera. But the double-edged sword in the sense too, right? That they don't come out and support you then either necessarily when things are getting tough. And we were talking in the green room just before we came on about, you know, Putin's sort of propagandist in chief, the managing editor at RT, Margarita Simonyan, that she sort of virtually disappeared on Saturday, and then now has come back, obviously, and after having championed Prigozhin for a long time, she's, you know, she's castigating him and supporting the president, of course. So what's the message that the Russian people are getting, number one? And, you know, how are they responding as far as you can tell?
Yeah, so a good question. No, at this point, you know, I'd like to emphasize that there are a lot of unknowns, to be honest, and you know, we are dealing with the sources of information that are not very reliable. You know, we're dealing with Russian social media, official announcements from the Kremlin, from Lukashenko, from Prigozhin. So I would just caution, you know, we've seen some videos, but that does not necessarily mean that this, you know, reflects the general sort of situation on the ground. That's just, you know, a general sort of disclaimer that I have to make because there are so many unknowns and the information, you know, on this entire story hasn't been the most sort of reliable. Now, talking about, you know, the reaction of the Russian people, yes, I think you know, we have not seen, for example, you know, there is public information that military formations are moving towards Moscow. It is plausible that Putin did not act to stop these military formations to prevent escalation, but we have not seen, you know, thousands of people surrounding the Kremlin to protect their leader or to stabilize the regime. As you mentioned, you know, there is very strong apathy. Some of them were congratulating Wagner troops. Some of them just were staying out of the way and going around, you know, with about their own business. So I don't think there is consensus in Russia. The opinion is divided, but it is clear that they're not very politically active. And overall, Prigozhin's drastic actions and rhetoric, I think, breaks the taboo of discussing publicly the disastrous performance of the Russian military and more generally the rationale for the war in the first place. So, you know, if the Russian military continues to underperform or the Ukrainian counteroffensive achieves some breakthroughs, I think the public criticism could only increase, and we might see, I guess, some protest or at least more active questioning of the war effort, of, you know, its successes and failures, and whether it was worth it. But at the moment, I don't think that there is a consensus in Russia, and we see that the general public as such, they're not ready to actively participate in the political life, either for Putin or against him.
Can I add one thing, which is just to say that Putin is acutely aware of this problem of controlling public perceptions around this. And he's gone to great lengths in his speeches to create a story that the elite was cohesive and to praise the security actors who have fended off this insurgency. And the other thing that I found so notable is just yesterday, they released video of Putin out in public, just completely flocked by adoring Russians. And that hasn't, you know, this is the germaphobe Putin who sits at the 90-foot-long tables. And so they are acutely aware that they needed to manage public perceptions around this and show Putin as a popular leader residing over a cohesive and loyal apparatus. So they are acutely aware of the question that you just raised.
Yeah, that video was pretty remarkable. Andrea, I want to go back to something you said at the outset, and I know you indicated that one of the big questions in your mind that you're going to be watching, and so you don't have the answer here necessarily, is what ultimately happens with Wagner. But I do want, I mean, you know, in many ways, Wagner was the most effective, most battle hardened, and I'm not talking about all of the conscripts out of the prisons that they just sent into the meat grinder, but some of their fighters are some of the most battle hardened troops that that are fighting on the Russian side. What's the impact, do you think, on the war of them coming off of the battlefield in a sense, or absorbed into the regular military? Is that a good thing for Russia, or are these guys kind of rogue elements that won't respect the chain of command in a sense, such as it is, or whatever? I mean, are they a disruptor, or are they a force multiplier into the Russian regulars?
So that's a great question, and I think we don't know the answer yet. In terms of kind of immediate impact on the battlefield, I mean, we know that Wagner fighters weren't playing a key role over the last several weeks, right? So they were able to secure the victory in Bakhmut, but then Prigozhin had pulled his fighters back and kind of turned responsibility for holding Bakhmut to the Russian armed forces. So it's not like there was a lot of disruption immediately on the front lines, but your question is really the right one, and something that we'll have to be watching is what, they are, the Wagner fighters have been the most effective forces so far in Ukraine. And so it is really unclear to me what happens to them moving forward if they are folded into the Russian military. We don't know about the distrust and, like you said, their willingness to obey the chain of command. So I don't have a good answer for you. I think this is one thing that people are going to have to be paying close attention to, is A, their willingness to actually sign on and fight with the Russian military, and B, their ability, we know that the Russian military has been plagued by all sorts of problems. And so once these fighters are folded into the military, will they then be made less effective? We also don't know the answer to that. So I don't have a good answer yet at this point in time.
So you had indicated at the beginning that perhaps one of the catalysts for the events of last weekend was this sort of July 1st deadline for militias to essentially sign on to Ministry of Defense forces. And so I guess we don't really have any good data yet about to what degree that is happening. Do you think that with them off of with Wagner off the field, though, that actually pressure then is lessened on addressing the bureaucracy, the corruption, and the incompetence of the military itself? I mean, this was this kind of this other force that demonstrated all of those deficiencies. If that's now no longer there, that demonstration effect is no longer there, does that relieve the pressure on the powers that be?
It could, but again, we don't know the future of the Wagner group, and I'm not entirely convinced that they'll be totally disbanded. And so I think there's reports that they're creating kind of a base for those fighters to continue on from Belarus. I think there's still reports that some of those fighters are still continuing inside Russia, and there's been some great Russian kind of investigative reporting that suggests that Wagner continues its recruiting kind of unabated. And so I don't know. I think the threat of the insurgency has been neutralized, but the future role of these Wagner fighters, to me, is still extremely unclear.
And Michèle, Wagner, in addition to its role in the Ukraine war, has played a number of other roles for Putin, right? It has been a sort of plausible, deniable extension of his ambitions in Syria, as well as in parts of Africa. Prigozhin famously ran the troll farms that have gotten involved in numerous elections around the world, including the 2016 presidential election here in the U.S. And it has served a purpose of keeping the other military leaders in check and not allow anybody to become too powerful. I think we've seen plenty of times in history that even a disastrous military engagement can create military leaders that people rally around. And we still, 150 years later, as people in this country rally around General Lee, or the Japanese prime minister is going to pay homage at Yasukuni Shrine to Class A war criminals and the like. So what happens in this void that's created on these other areas of utility for Wagner, do you think?
Well, I think, again, the answer is we don't know yet, because on the one hand, it's unlikely that the Russian state will rely on Wagner, to the same degree in places like Syria or Africa or elsewhere, which will almost certainly create a bit of a vacuum. That said, it's not clear that Prigozhin won't find someone to continue to finance these operations and continue of his own accord. And I do think we know that the members of the Wagner Group are extremely loyal. And if they don't, I don't know how much they care whether that's Russia paying for their operations or someone else, or a cutout. They're very loyal to the organization and to their own leader. So I think it's an open question of, that relates to the question that Andrea was raising, which is what is the fate of this thing, and will Prigozhin continue this group's operations under, with a different, customer, if you will, or a different, client paying for what they're doing. So I think it's just it's too early to tell. That said, if the group does shrink or limit its size and effectiveness, you will see some vacuums developing in critical places. And I don't think Russia, given the singular focus of Russian forces on Ukraine, I don't think they'd be sending conventional Russian forces to fill the gap.
Andrea had earlier brought up this point that Shoigu and Gerasimov, the defense minister and the head of military forces, remain in place, and I assume obviously Putin couldn't get rid of them. That would be caving to the demands of Prigozhin to a certain degree. And he obviously, we've seen time and time again, and it's been mentioned on this already today, his emphasis on loyalty and the like. On the other hand, it's a risk to keep those guys in place because of their incompetent prosecution of this war. Yeah. Where do you think we're going on the Russian regular military front? Do you think a shakeup is inevitable?
Yeah, I mean, I think every time Putin's been faced with the choice of, do I, keep the people loyal to me in place, or do I put the most effective leaders in place, he's chosen the former. He puts loyalty over competent leadership. And I think right now he's playing for time. I think Andrea would love, and Andrius, your views, but I think first of all, he's waiting to see, how effective will the Ukrainian counteroffensive be. He had a lot of time, Russian forces had a lot of time to build defensive lines, very lethal gray zones where there's artillery, drones, mortars, rockets, all kinds of kinetic options for them to, if the Ukrainians break through one line, there's two more lines where they can, meet with lethal response. So this is very tough to break through these, very reinforced Russian defensive lines. So that's thing one. So he's waiting to see. Maybe they can't get very far. Maybe we'll be successful, at least on the defense. The second thing is he probably knows that this is the one shot for this year for Ukraine, and they're not going to have another shot till next spring at the earliest, in terms of equipment shortages and so forth. And in that time, he's also thinking, okay, next year we're going to be in the U.S. election cycle. Maybe I'm going to get a U.S. president at the end of 2024, 2025, early 2025, that has a different view on Russia, relations with Russia, and on Ukraine. If President Trump were reelected, I think you'd see U.S. policy potentially change rather substantially with regard to Russia, Ukraine, and NATO. So I think he's playing for time, and that means that he'll probably live with what he's got and see how this unfolds between now and the end of the year. And I don't envision he's going to make dramatic changes in the military leadership at this point, because I think even now, even more than before, he's going to prize that loyalty and the ability to, these are people I can control.
I want to digress for just a moment, though, Michèle, and ask you, I mentioned to you earlier this morning that I had seen Secretary Blinken yesterday, and one of the things that he said is that one of the real impediments getting to the preliminary discussions and ultimately negotiations and whatnot that will bring this conflict to an end is Putin's belief that he has time on his side, that he can outlast the United States, the Western Alliance, and Ukraine itself, and that it is incumbent on us, therefore, to disabuse him of that notion. What's the best way to do that? How do we disabuse him of that notion clearly? And I know that there's a NATO summit upcoming where some package could come out for Ukraine that would be sending some pretty big signals. But what are you anticipating on the U.S. policy front, knowing that we also have got the realities of a 2024 election cycle looming, and some on the political spectrum who aren't willing to be as generous with Ukraine as they've perhaps been all along?
Yeah, I think, continued efforts on the economic side, particularly with export controls, to hinder his ability to reconstitute and rebuild his military and replace lost equipment, etc. Continued pressure on others to, reduce their energy purchases, but I think there are limits to that, as we've seen. Continued diplomatic isolation and not allowing him to sort of get on a get well plan, as long as he's fighting in Ukraine. But I think ultimately, it's really critical that we help the Ukrainians achieve some greater momentum on the ground, and that we prevent Russia from taking any more territory. So I do think this counteroffensive is pretty critical. And in terms of the NATO summit, I think signaling to Putin that he has effectively changed Ukraine's situation vis-a-vis NATO forever. At the minimum, you're going to see a number of key allies step up with multi-year, massive security assistance, training, military support packages. And you're going to see some acceleration of the path to membership for Ukraine. I don't think they're going to be offered membership, at this summit, but I think there is an emerging consensus that one way to prevent a recurrence of this in the future from Russia is to ensure that Russia knows that NATO will respond to support their security in some meaningful fashion. And so, time is not on his side. I mean, this is not going to get better for him. It's only going to get worse over time.
And Andrea, just going back to the military for 1 second, when you and other experts of looking at at the military in Russia and as it's deployed in Ukraine, do you see, is this a unified army now, or is it an army made up of a bunch of militias? I mean, obviously Wagner's been taken off the field, but we know that there are others out there as well. Zirov and the Chechens on one side. You've even seen these sort of private militias that are associated with Gazprom and even the Russian version of NASA. And the like. How unified is the military?
So I think the Russian military, as a whole, is fairly unified. That's to say nothing of the corruption and the poor morale and all of the other problems that plague it. The issue is, as you're saying, you have these other armed groups that sit kind of tangential or on the periphery of the Russian military, and I think that's concerning for a whole host of reasons, not the least of which this insurgency from Prigozhin and the Wagner group has made clear. And I guess when you look at kind of political stability in other authoritarian regimes, I'm thinking of a Sudan model, where basically you have the infighting across diverse security actors. That to me is a plausible scenario inside Russia. And I think the insurgency has underscored the risks of that. So the Russian military itself is very professional and it's quite unified. But the problem is I don't think that the Russian state actually has a true monopoly over the use of force and violence. And so it is very plausible to me that if you get another kind of catalyst that sets off, imagine, it's always difficult to anticipate what the exact catalyst would be. But now that Putin has been shown to be weakened, you could imagine that there could be other groups out in the regions, in the North Caucasus, in the Far East, in Tatarstan, in other regions that now believe that the center is weak and view this as an opportune time to push for greater autonomy. That would unleash a violent response from the center. But you could also imagine, I mean, even within the Russian security services, there's 4 different security services: the National Guard, the FSB, the SVR. So there's actually, I mean, Putin has intentionally fragmented those, as Andreas was saying earlier, so that they could monitor and kind of keep tabs on what the other is doing, so that no one center becomes so powerful. But that kind of fragmentation across the system more generally, I think, raises a significant risk over the long term. And I think that is kind of the worst case scenario, is that if there is another challenge, that you do see the fragmenting and you get infighting across the Kadyrovs, other kind of regional actors, and even a fragmenting of the security services themselves. That is a plausible scenario in today's Russia.
So Andrius, you and I have discussed in the past how Putin is a type of leader who does not let a good crisis go to waste, in a sense. And you think about other mutinies or coup attempts that have sort of murky origins. I'm thinking about Turkey several years ago. Erdogan used that as an amazing opportunity to purge. And do we anticipate that that will happen here as well? Obviously, there have been a lot of news reports that Prigozhin's sort of allied general Surovikin has kind of disappeared or has been taken in for questioning, and there are potentially others who either didn't speak up in support of the president or didn't do so enough. Are you anticipating a coming purge, and will that be something that we kind of see publicly, or it's going to have to be on you and Andrea and others to try to uncover?
I think, yes, I do anticipate some kind of purge at home. We are seeing the first signals these days. So the General Surovikin being reportedly arrested, although there are some reports in Russian media that this is not true. But overall, I think Putin, is pressured to show that, challenges to his regime will not go unanswered. And he has to send a clear message, to others. Otherwise, it would invite new challengers to his regime in the near future. Because making a deal with Prigozhin just hours after you accuse him of treason, this really erodes Putin's credibility. So to somewhat regain his credibility at home, he has to find scapegoats. And I think this is very likely. He does not have any other good means to respond. On the military front, they don't have the capacity to respond with conventional means and sort of distract the attention with a very successful, spectacular attack on the Ukrainian forces. It's impossible at the current stage, of the conflict. Yes, they could perhaps resort to some unconventional measures, for example, targeting civil infrastructure, critical infrastructure in Ukraine or elsewhere. But that would be just a sort of a temporary distraction from domestic challenges, but that would not send a message at home. So he needs to send a message at home, to his potential challengers. If that does not happen, I think that would be another sign of weakness, and that would sort of invite other challengers to emerge in the near future. So yes, I do expect that.
I want to ask you about Belarus, but before you do, I got to bring Andrea back in for 1 second. And I know you're not in the intelligence community anymore, so hopefully this is a fair question. But I mean, is it in our interest, the United States' interest, to push this notion of somebody like Surovikin, that he is, that he was somehow complicit and so on and so forth? In other words, because he is the one sort of general who showed that he was somewhat effective on the battlefield in Ukraine, that we actually have an interest in getting him off that field. So let's get him purged and keep the incompetence on the field of play.
I've definitely heard that theory out there, that this was kind of an information operation from our own intelligence community. I have no idea. I don't know. I'm going to plead the fifth on this one. Certainly that is out there circulating, but to me, that seems kind of a bridge too far. But again, there's lots that I was not privy to as a baby analyst at the agency. So I probably shouldn't comment.
We'll wait for the movie on that one. Okay. So Andreas, back to Belarus for a moment here. Obviously, it's one of the mysteries of this whole thing was the role that Lukashenko played. Why him? He's always sort of, I guess, been seen as particularly late of his puppet, or his complete client. But I guess maybe a little bit on that. But the bigger question I have is does Wagner, notwithstanding all of the open questions that Andrea has been talking about with regards to them, but does Wagner in Belarus have a broader security implication for, countries like where you are and elsewhere, particularly now with nuclear weapons having arrived in Belarus for the first time since the end of the Soviet era?
Yeah, so with regards to Lukashenko, well, once again, this very bizarre story and the sources of information are not great. But if we do believe that he really mediated between the two, and he was the one that helped reach the deal with Prigozhin, then I would see this kind of as a payback for Putin, who helped stabilize Lukashenko regime in the 2020, after when Lukashenko faced extreme challenge to his rule. There were huge protests after the elections, which were widely considered as fake elections. So sort of returning a favor, if we were to believe that. Now, talking about Wagner in Belarus, so yes, I agree. It's very important to monitor what happens with the Wagner group, how many former fighters follow Prigozhin to Belarus, what kind of conditions, military equipment Wagner is provided in Belarus, whether they find a way to finance themselves without the backing of the Russian state. So a lot of questions, but the very presence of thousands of hardened Wagner fighters in Belarus could become a threat to Ukraine. To be honest, there could be fears that Wagner fighters, well-equipped ones, could launch and open a small new front in northern Ukraine. Fighters could be also deployed, close to the borders with Poland, the Baltic states. Belarus has been actively trying to, probe these borders, sending various groups of refugees from Middle East. Baltic states intelligence intelligence agencies are reporting more intense efforts to probe the border before the NATO summit, upcoming NATO summit in Vilnius in July. So in general, yes, this is a destabilizing force there, especially, with the arrival also of nuclear weapons. And I think the Baltic states and Poland will actually, use this as an argument to request and, for greater NATO presence in the region, faster NATO presence in the region, basically, updating the plans on how the alliance would react to potential threats. Because it is also possible, now that Wagner is no longer a Russian state sort of a military company, once it is disbanded in Russia, they could claim, look, this is not, any provocations on the border are not being, implemented by the Russian side. It's a private military company. We have nothing to do with that. So there are a lot of scenarios there. And I think even Lukashenko himself, to be honest, cannot be completely safe or feel safe, with Wagner in Belarus. So a lot of threats there and a lot of possibilities, but we just don't know how they are going to evolve there.
So Michèle, earlier in our conversation, you said that basically nothing and really, so much had not gone to plan since the invasion for Putin. And yet we all remember that shortly before the invasion, Putin and Xi Jinping pledged their unlimited friendship with each other. I have to imagine that to some degree, Xi Jinping's roll his eyes ever since then, going like, what is wrong with this guy, to a certain degree. But the strategic imperative behind that, the strategic interests of China and what they kind of gain from the utility of Russia to them in their geopolitical designs as well as geoeconomic, haven't really changed. But talk about your view. I'd like to start with China specifically because it's the biggest one, but I want to talk about some of the other countries as well that Russia's got strategic relationships with. But how do you see the evolution there, or does this incident last weekend affect that either way, or is it a bump on their bigger picture road?
I mean, to your point, I think the strategic interests that bring them together to align on certain issues, that hasn't changed. And so, she still views Russia as a critical ally in sort of pushing back against the West, against what he sees as, American attempts to maintain hegemony in the Indo-Pacific and so forth. So, that hasn't changed. His dependence on Russia for energy supplies hasn't changed. But I do think he's very sensitive to reputational risk. And we've seen him even try to kind of walk walk a line on Ukraine where he's, on the one hand, he's clearly been supportive of Putin. On the other hand, he says to European leaders, "Oh, we're the first ones who would love to, bring the parties together and achieve peace. And we've laid out these principles, and we're the peace-loving nation. The U.S. is the warmonger, etc." So, but I think that this latest chapter will encourage him to further distance himself from Putin specifically, or Putin personally. I don't think he wants to have any photo ops in the coming future with him and Putin side by side, or handshaking or hugging, proclaiming their unlimited friendship. I think so. The strategic interests will keep them cooperating at the sort of tactical and opportunistic level. But I don't think, Xi has got to be wanting to distance himself from Putin specifically. I also think this is a very threatening scenario for China. I mean, it's got, there are a number of private security firms that work in support of the Belt and Road Initiative around the world. I'm sure someone has been tasked inside the Chinese national security apparatus to assess those groups and whether there's any threat at all that they could ultimately pose to China domestically. I think it's a different situation, but what he watched last Saturday has got to just like chill just be incredibly chilling for a leader like Xi.
So the China situation is a unique one because of its geostrategic ambition and its size and so on. But Russia has got a number of other strategic relationships that are complicating to U.S. policy in various places, complicating to the U.S. economy, and complicating on the battlefield in Ukraine. So I'm thinking about their relationship with India. India, again, a buyer of cheap Russian energy, a buyer of Russian military kit and the like, and a determined sort of non-aligned country. Iran has continued to benefit from selling military material into Russia. Saudi Arabia and their participation with Russia in OPEC Plus, a complicated relationship, getting more so, I know. Turkey and other. How do you see some of these other key Russian relationships evolving? Are they having a similar calculus as the one you just described for Xi, or is it different because they are not as big?
I don't see a big difference in that. They're in the case of India, the dependencies there for energy and for Russian spare parts and so forth for their military. I don't think the Indian leadership is happy about that. Because I actually think from a policy perspective, they're more aligned with the United States and with the West on any number of issues. But it is what it is. And so I think that they'll try to continue the trade that they need to keep their economies and their militaries going, but they'll probably not want to be embracing Putin himself, very closely. Same with, Iran, Saudi, Turkey. Again, I think what's driving this is their interests, and that hasn't changed. But they'll probably be more careful in terms of identifying specifically with Putin as opposed to with kind of the larger Russian apparatus.
So I want to spend the last couple of minutes here, Andrea, talking to you about the counteroffensive. Michèle made the point a few minutes ago about the importance of this particular counteroffensive, given the calendar, given where we are in the course of the fighting season of the year. There's kind of this one shot. They've got all of this new Western kit that's arrived in the theater, and then you've got the imperatives of the election next year that we talked about earlier. So, what is your assessment? Several weeks into this thing now, notwithstanding what happened in Russia last week, but I mean, what's the status of this counteroffensive? Is it playing out kind of as you would have expected, and perhaps media and sort of political voices allowed us to get ahead of ourselves in terms of expecting too much too soon out of Ukraine? It's tougher to be on the offensive than it is to be on the defensive in many ways. And as you and Michèle said, the Russians have dug in. They've had time to dig in. What do you see?
Well, I think certainly from Ukraine's perspective, it's gone slower than they would have hoped for. And I think kind of given where they are, we're 3 or maybe 4 weeks into the offensive. And I think that the Ukrainians themselves would have hoped that they would have been farther along by this point. So I think that they probably are running behind where they expected they would be at this point. We do see some small incremental gains on a couple of different axes of the offensive, but still it's very slow going. And we have heard Ukrainian officials themselves kind of recognize that it has been harder maybe than they had even expected. The key thing, though, I think, is that the Ukrainians continue to say, and I guess, I take it at face value, which is that the main event, and this was a kind of the quote from Ukraine's Minister of Defense, Reznikov, that the main event has not yet started. And so what we have been seeing is the Ukrainians probing the front, looking for signs of weakness. But as Michèle said, I mean, the Russians have spent months, I think, reinforcing those front lines. And it is proving extremely difficult for Ukraine to find those vulnerabilities and be able to exploit any weakness in those front lines. And we're hearing, I think, that the Russian objective now is just not to lose territory. So their mindset has very much shifted. And as Michèle said, I think they're trying to ride this out because they know that there will be only kind of one big push this year. And so they are very much focused on those defensive operations. So it's really difficult to know what to expect. I mean, these things are often very fluid and unpredictable. But I think from Ukraine's perspective, they are going to be very eager to be able to show that they can retake significant territory. I mean, they have to prove that they can put Western equipment to good use. I mean, I think those are the stakes. So they have to show that they can effectively use the Western kit that they've received. And they have to be able to demonstrate that they can take more significant territory, much more than the incremental gains that we've seen thus far. So, again, with a lot of questions, more questions sometimes than answers. It's really difficult to anticipate how it will go from here. But there are concerns that those Russian lines are quite entrenched, and that they will be difficult to move. I know the U.S. emphasis and focus is really on helping Ukraine take advantage of any opportunities that this insurgency might have created. And so all kind of efforts and all focus will be on that. And the United States and European allies continue to surge in the equipment that the Ukrainians need. We know that there were some gains early in the offensive, but it came also with some significant losses for the Ukrainians in terms of infantry fighting vehicles, some of the Leopards, some of the demining equipment. And so again, allies are stepping up and surging that equipment back into the war. So again, really difficult to anticipate how it goes from here. We were expecting that it would be kind of a slow, kind of deliberate offensive that looked more like Kherson than the rapid advances in Kharkiv. But I think even now at 4 weeks in, some people are starting to get a little bit nervous about what the offensive will be able to deliver.
So I want to give the last word to you, Michèle, and having said, just picking up on what Andrea said there at the very end. As you sit in Washington, I know you're not sitting in Washington today, but as you sit in Washington, does the events of last week create an opening politically in Washington that the White House needs to exploit with Congress, in the sense that, like, wait a minute, there's a chink in the armor of Putin here. This is an opportunity. it's going to take their eye off the ball, perhaps, in Ukraine. Even if it doesn't, there's a perception that he's got to watch his flank around him now as much as he does what's going on in Ukraine. So there's an opportunity, and that perhaps more largesse or more willingness to support Ukraine from some of those waverers in Congress.
Yeah, no, I do think that it's one of several arguments that need to be made, that now is not the time to take our foot off the accelerator, that now is not the time to pull back from support from Ukraine. We have to do as much as we possibly can to make sure that this counteroffensive is successful. And I think the potential weakness of Putin just adds fuel to the argument. So, use the NATO summit to shore up NATO cohesion, make sure that the next tranches of funding go through, and get the Ukrainians through the end of this year, and then we'll see where we are. But now would that be absolutely the worst possible time to pull back on support for Ukraine?
Well, with that, we will continue to follow this story and dedicate Teneo Insights calls accordingly. For now, I want to thank Michèle Flournoy, Andrea Kendall-Taylor, and Andrius Tursa for joining me today, and to all of you for joining us as well. To our viewers in the United States, all the best for a very long holiday weekend. To our viewers in the UK, thank you for giving us a reason to have one. Until next time, I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York. Have a great day.